He adopted a pregnant stranger for 5, then froze when she whispered, "Your brother promised to save me." The courthouse steps burned hot under the midday sun, and Thomas McCready sat there like a man waiting for his own judgment. His boots, cracked leather held together by stubbornness and prayer, rested on stone that had seen too many broken promises. The $5 bill in his pocket felt heavier than the Winchester rifle he'd sold to get it. He wasn't supposed to be here. Wasn't supposed to care about the woman sitting 3 steps below him, her dress faded blue like morning sky after rain. She held her belly with both hands, protective and gentle, the way his mother used to hold wounded birds. But Thomas had learned long ago that some things couldn't be saved, no matter how carefully you held them. The woman's name was Sarah. That was all she'd told him when she'd approached him outside Murphy's saloon the night before. Just Sarah, spoken soft like a prayer she wasn't sure anyone would answer. She'd looked at him with eyes that knew too much sorrow for someone so young, maybe 25 at most. Her hair, brown as river stones, escaped from pins that had given up trying to hold it. "I need someone to marry me," she'd said, standing in the yellow light spilling from Murphy's windows. "Just on paper, just to make the baby legitimate." Thomas had stared at her then, whiskey making his thoughts move like honey in winter. "Why me?" "Because you look like someone who understands what it means to be alone." She'd been right about that. Thomas McCready knew alone the way other men knew their horses or their guns. He'd been alone since the war ended, and he'd come home to find his farm burned and his brother gone. Alone since he'd buried his parents under the old oak tree and walked away from the only life he'd known. Alone in a way that made even the sound of his own breathing seem too loud in the night. But marriage, even a fake one, even for $5, felt like more than he could carry. "I got nothing to offer a woman," he told her. "No land, no house, barely got enough money for beans and coffee." "I'm not asking you to take care of me," Sarah had said. "Just to give my child a name that won't bring shame." The courthouse clerk, a thin man with ink-stained fingers and tired eyes, had married them that morning with all the ceremony of recording a cattle sale. Thomas had signed his name in careful letters, the pen scratching against paper like fingernails against wood. Sarah had signed hers with a shaking hand, and when she'd looked up at him afterward, he'd seen something in her face that made his chest tight. Relief, gratitude, and something else he couldn't name. Now they sat on these hot steps, husband and wife by law, strangers by choice. The marriage certificate folded in Sarah's small purse felt like a lie that might somehow become true if they both pretended long enough. "Where will you go now?" Thomas asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Sarah touched her belly again, that gentle, protective gesture that made him think of his mother and wounded birds. "I don't know. Maybe Denver. I heard there's work there for women who can sew. That's a long way for a woman in your condition." "I've walked long ways before." Thomas believed her. There was something in the set of her shoulders, in the way she looked straight ahead instead of down, that spoke of hard roads already traveled. He found himself wondering what had brought her here, to this small town where nothing good ever seemed to happen, begging strangers to marry her for the price of a decent meal. "The baby's father," he said carefully. "He dead." Sarah was quiet for so long that Thomas thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely louder than the wind moving through the courthouse eaves. "He made promises he couldn't keep." Something in those words hit Thomas like a punch to the stomach. He'd heard them before, or words like them, spoken by his brother James the last time they'd talked. James, who'd always been the charming one, the one who could talk his way out of trouble as easy as breathing. James, who'd left town owing money to half the businesses and hearts broken in the other half. "What kind of promises?" Thomas asked, though part of him already knew he didn't want the answer. Sarah turned to look at him then, really look at him, and Thomas saw his own eyes looking back. The same gray-green color, the same way of holding sadness like something too heavy to put down. "He said he'd come back for me," she whispered. "Said he'd marry me proper, and we'd have a good life somewhere safe." The world went very still around Thomas. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. What was his name? James. James McCready. The $5 bill in Thomas's pocket felt like it was on fire. His brother's name hung in the air between them like smoke from a gun that couldn't be unfired. All those months of wondering where James had gone, what he'd been doing, who he'd hurt along the way. And now here was the answer, sitting beside him on courthouse steps, carrying his brother's child and his brother's lies. Sarah must have seen something change in his face because she started to stand up, moving careful and slow, like a person expecting to be hit. "I should go," she said. "Thank you for what you did. The $5, I mean, for the marriage." "Wait." The word came out harder than Thomas meant it to. "Sarah, wait." She stopped, one hand on the stone railing, the other still protecting her belly. "That man," Thomas said, his voice sounding strange in his own ears. "James McCready. Did he ever mention having a brother?" Sarah's face went pale as morning mist. "He said his brother was dead, killed in the war." Thomas almost laughed, but it would have come out bitter and sharp. Dead. Maybe that was easier for James to say than the truth, that he'd left his brother behind like everything else he'd ever claimed to love. "Well," Thomas said, standing up slow, "seems James McCready was a liar about more than just coming back." Sarah stared at him, understanding dawning in her eyes like sunrise over mountains. "You're his brother." "I am." They stood there looking at each other, two people bound together now by more than a piece of paper and $5. Bound by the ghost of a man who'd made promises to both of them and kept none. The sun was starting its long slide toward evening, painting the courthouse steps gold and red. Somewhere in town, a church bell rang the hour, and Thomas found himself thinking about wounded birds again, about the way his mother used to feed them sugar water from her fingertip until they were strong enough to fly away. But some birds, he remembered now, never got strong enough to leave. Some birds you just had to keep caring for, one day at a time, until caring for them became as natural as breathing. "I got a cabin about 10 miles north of here," he heard himself saying. "It's not much, but it's got a roof and a stove. You could stay there until the baby comes. If you want." Sarah's eyes filled with tears she didn't let fall. "Why would you do that?" Thomas looked at her, this woman who carried his brother's child and his brother's broken promises, and tried to find words for something he didn't fully understand himself. "Maybe because James should have," he said finally. "Maybe because someone needs to keep the promises he didn't." The weight of those words settled between them like dust after a long ride, heavy and real and impossible to take back. The cabin sat like a prayer in the middle of nowhere, its wooden walls weathered gray by years of wind and rain. Thomas had built it with his own hands after the war, each log cut and placed with the kind of careful attention a man gives to something he knows he'll have to live with forever. It wasn't much, one room, a stone fireplace, a small loft where he kept his few possessions, but it was honest shelter, and that was more than many had. Sarah stood in the doorway that first evening, her hand resting on the frame like she was afraid the whole thing might disappear if she let go. The setting sun painted everything gold and red, and Thomas watched her take in the simple space. The narrow bed he'd built along one wall, the rough table and 2 chairs, the cast-iron stove that had cost him a month's wages but kept the place warm through the long winters. "It's not what you're used to, I expect," he said, suddenly seeing the cabin through her eyes. The gaps between the logs where the wind whistled through. The floor that was just packed earth covered with a few scattered rugs his mother had woven before she died. The silence that lived in every corner like something wild that had learned to be tame. "It's perfect," Sarah said, and something in her voice made him believe she meant it. Those first days passed like water over stones, slow and steady, and wearing away at edges neither of them knew they had. Thomas gave her the bed and made himself a pallet on the floor near the fire. He cooked simple meals, beans and bacon, cornbread when he had flour, coffee that was more chicory than anything else but tasted like home anyway. Sarah ate without complaint, though he could see she wasn't used to such plain food. She helped where she could, mending his shirts with neat stitches, sweeping the floor with a broom he'd forgotten he owned. But mostly she sat by the window, her hands folded over her growing belly, watching the sky change colors like she was reading a book written in clouds and light. They didn't talk much. What was there to say? He was James McCready's brother. She was James McCready's woman, carrying James McCready's child. The weight of that truth sat between them like a stone too heavy to lift, so they worked around it instead, careful not to let their words bump against it and send everything crashing down. But silence had its own language, and Thomas found himself learning to read the small signs Sarah left scattered through their days. The way she pressed her hand to her back when she thought he wasn't looking. How she saved the best pieces of bacon for him, even when he knew she was still hungry. The soft humming she did while mending clothes, melodies he didn't recognize, but that sounded like lullabies for children not yet born. 3 weeks into September, the first cold snap came down from the mountains like a warning of harder times ahead. Thomas woke to find frost on the windows and Sarah shivering under the thin blanket he'd given her. Without a word, he took his winter coat from the peg by the door and laid it over her sleeping form. When she woke, she found him feeding more wood to the fire, and she looked at the coat covering her like it was something precious. "You'll freeze," she said. "I've been cold before." She sat up slowly, the coat falling to her lap, and Thomas saw how the child inside her had grown in these few weeks. Her face was fuller now, less sharp with hunger, and there was color in her cheeks that hadn't been there on those courthouse steps. "Thomas," she said, his name soft in her mouth like she was tasting it. "Can I ask you something?" He nodded, not trusting his voice. "What was he like?" "James, I mean, when you were boys." Thomas stared into the fire, watching flames dance against the stone. How could he explain James to someone who had only known him as a man who made promises he couldn't keep? How could he tell her about the brother who had caught fireflies in mason jars just to watch them glow? Who had taught him to whistle by pressing leaves between his thumbs? Who had cried when their dog died and made Thomas promise to bury him under the apple tree so he wouldn't be alone? He was bright, Thomas said finally, like a flame. Everything he touched seemed to catch fire and burn a little brighter. Sarah's hand moved to her belly. He told me about his dreams. Said he wanted to see the ocean someday. Said he wanted to build a house so big you could get lost in it. James always wanted more than what he had, even when what he had was good. And you? What did you want? The question caught Thomas off guard. He'd spent so many years just trying to survive, to keep moving forward one day at a time, that he'd forgotten there had been a time when wanting things seemed possible. "I wanted to keep the farm," he said. "Grow old in the house where I was born. Maybe have children who would do the same." What happened to it? The farm. Thomas felt that familiar tightness in his chest, the old hurt that never quite healed. Burned during the war. Raiders came through, took what they wanted, burned the rest. When I got back, there was nothing left but ashes and memories. Sarah was quiet for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice was barely louder than the crackling fire. "I'm sorry. It was a long time ago." "No," she said. "I'm sorry for bringing this to your door. For making you take care of something that should have been his responsibility." Thomas looked at her then, really looked, and saw tears she was trying not to let fall. Her hands were pressed flat against her belly, protective and fierce, and he realized she wasn't just carrying his brother's child. She was carrying his brother's guilt, his brother's broken promises, his brother's whole life of leaving things undone. "Sarah," he said, the words coming out rough, "you didn't bring this to me. James did, long before he ever met you." The truth of that settled between them like snow, quiet and white, and covering everything that had come before. Thomas stood up and walked to the window, looking out at land that stretched empty in every direction. The moon was rising, full and silver, turning the world into something that looked like it had been painted with light. Behind him, he heard Sarah moving, the rustle of fabric, the soft sound of her settling back under the blankets. When he turned around, she was watching him with eyes that seemed to hold questions she wasn't ready to ask. "Thomas." "Yes." "Tomorrow, when you go to town for supplies, will you come back?" The question hit him like a punch to the stomach. She thought he might leave her. Thought he might wake up one morning and decide that James's promises weren't his to keep after all. "I'll come back," he said. "How do I know that?" Thomas thought about all the ways a man could make a promise. All the words James had probably used to convince her he'd be there when she needed him. But words were just air, and air couldn't keep anyone warm. Instead, he walked to the small trunk where he kept his few treasures and pulled out something wrapped in faded cloth. He brought it to Sarah and placed it gently in her hands. "What is it?" she asked. "Open it." Her fingers were careful as she unwrapped the cloth, revealing a small wooden horse, carved smooth by years of handling. It fit perfectly in her palm, and Thomas watched as she traced the lines of its mane with her fingertip. "James carved it for me when we were boys," Thomas said. "It was the last thing he gave me before he left. They were the kind of tears that came when someone gave you something you didn't know you needed." That night, as Thomas lay on his pallet by the dying fire, he heard Sarah whisper something in her sleep, words too soft to make out, but heavy with meaning all the same. And for the first time since James had left, Thomas found himself wondering if maybe some promises were worth keeping, even when they weren't yours to make. October came to the cabin like a slow-burning fever, painting the few scattered trees around them in shades of gold and red that reminded Thomas of Sarah's hair when the lamplight caught it just right. The child inside her had grown heavy now, making her movements careful and deliberate, like someone carrying water in cupped hands. She was due any day, and Thomas found himself listening for changes in her breathing, watching for signs that the time had come. It was on a gray afternoon, with rain drumming against the cabin roof like impatient fingers, that Sarah finally broke the silence they had built around James's name. She was sitting by the window, her hands resting on her belly, watching water run down the glass in crooked lines that looked like tears. "He used to sing to me," she said, the words falling into the quiet room like stones into still water. Thomas looked up from the harness he was mending, leather oil dark on his hands. "James!" Every night when we were together, he had a voice like honey and whiskey mixed together, made even the saddest songs sound beautiful. She turned from the window to look at Thomas, and he saw something in her face he hadn't seen before. Not just sadness, but anger too, sharp and bright as a blade fresh from the forge. He sang Barbara Allen the night before he left. "Do you know that song?" Thomas nodded. Their mother used to sing it while she worked, the old ballad about love and loss and dying of a broken heart. It seemed fitting that James would choose that one. "He sang it like he was saying goodbye," Sarah continued. "But I didn't understand then. I thought he was just being romantic, the way he always was, making everything feel bigger and more important than it really was." The rain grew heavier, and Thomas could hear it running off the roof in small waterfalls. He set down the harness and gave Sarah his full attention, sensing that something was breaking open inside her, something that had been held back too long. "Tell me about that night," he said gently. Sarah was quiet for so long that Thomas thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely louder than the rain. "We were in Kansas City. He'd been working for a cattle baron named Morrison, something about moving herds north. Good money, he said. Enough for us to get married proper, buy some land, start fresh somewhere new." She touched the little wooden horse Thomas had given her, which she now kept always in her pocket. He'd been strange all week, nervous, looking over his shoulder like he expected trouble to walk through the door. But when I asked him about it, he just kissed me and changed the subject. Thomas felt something cold settle in his stomach. He knew that look on James's face, had seen it plenty of times when they were boys and James had done something he couldn't take back. What kind of work was he really doing? Thomas asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. Sarah's laugh was bitter as burnt coffee. "That's what I asked him that last night. He'd been drinking more than usual, and when he sang that song, there were tears in his eyes. Real tears. I'd never seen James cry before." She stood up slowly, walking to the fireplace where the flames cast dancing shadows on the walls. "So I pushed him, kept asking until he finally told me the truth." "What truth?" "He wasn't moving cattle for Morrison. He was stealing them." The words hung in the air like smoke. Thomas closed his eyes, feeling the familiar weight of his brother's choices settling on his shoulders. Of course it would be something like this. Him and two other men, Sarah continued. They've been taking small herds, changing the brands, selling them in towns where nobody asked questions. Morrison never even knew James worked for him. How long had he been doing it? Months. Since before he met me. Sarah's voice broke a little on those last words. Everything he gave me, every nice thing, every promise about our future, it was all built on stolen money. Thomas understood now why James had looked nervous, why he'd been drinking more. Cattle rustling was a hanging offense in most territories, and men like Morrison had long memories and longer reach. What happened that night? After he told you? Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, though the cabin was warm from the fire. I told him to stop. Said we could make an honest living somewhere else, that I didn't care about having nice things if they came from stealing. But he said it was too late for that. Too late how? Morrison had found out. Someone had seen them changing brands, talked to the wrong people. James said Morrison's men were already looking for them. It was only a matter of time before they caught up. Sarah turned to face Thomas, and he saw the ghost of that night living in her eyes, the memory of watching her whole world crumble in the space of a single conversation. He packed his things while I begged him to stay, to face whatever was coming. But James was never good at facing hard things. You probably know that better than anyone. Thomas nodded. Even as a boy, James had run from consequences, broken a neighbor's window, and disappeared for 3 days. Got caught stealing apples and blamed it on Thomas. Always looking for the easy way out, the path that led away from trouble instead of through it. He left before dawn, Sarah said. Kissed me goodbye and promised he'd send for me once things cooled down. Said he'd make everything right, that we'd have that life he'd promised. But he never sent for you. No word for 6 months. Then I heard from a woman in Dodge City that Morrison's men had found him. Shot him down in a saloon like a dog in the street. The rain outside was gentler now, a steady whisper against the windows. Thomas felt something break loose inside his chest, a grief he'd been carrying without knowing it. His brother was dead. Had been dead for months while Thomas wondered where he'd gone, what he was doing, if he'd ever come home. I'm sorry, he said, the words feeling small and useless. Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. The worst part wasn't that he died. It was that he died still running, still trying to find that easy way out that never existed. She walked back to her chair by the window, moving slow and careful. I kept waiting for someone to come for me, Morrison's men or the law, thinking they want to ask questions about what I knew. But nobody ever came. I guessed to them I was just another woman James McCready had left behind. Is that why you needed the marriage? Because of Morrison? Partly. But mostly because I couldn't bear the thought of this child growing up with the name of a thief and a coward. Her voice got stronger, fiercer. I wanted better for him. Or her. A clean name, even if it had to come from a stranger. Thomas looked at her sitting there. This woman who had loved his brother enough to forgive his lies, who carried his child and his shame with equal grace. She deserved better than James had given her. Better than a life built on stolen money and broken promises. Sarah, he said, his voice rough with emotion he didn't know how to name. The child won't be a stranger's. It'll be a McCready. That means something, even if James forgot what. She looked at him with eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. And what does it mean to you, being a McCready? Thomas thought about his parents, buried under the old apple tree. About the farm that had burned while he was away fighting someone else's war. About the promises he'd made to himself in the long, dark nights when survival was all that mattered. It means you don't run, he said finally. It means you keep your word, even when it costs you everything. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her hands moving over her belly in slow circles. Outside, the rain was stopping, and the first pale light of evening was beginning to filter through the clouds. The baby's coming soon, she said softly. I know. What happens after? When it's born, and I'm well enough to travel. Thomas realized he'd been dreading this question for weeks, ever since he'd first felt himself caring what happened to her. Ever since caring for her had become as natural as breathing. That depends, he said. On what? On whether you want to keep running, or if you're ready to stay somewhere and build something that won't burn down. Sarah looked at him for a long time, and Thomas saw something new in her face. Not the desperate gratitude he'd seen on the courthouse steps, or the careful politeness of their first weeks together. Something deeper. Something that looked like hope. But before she could answer, a sharp pain crossed her face, and she pressed both hands to her belly with a gasp that told Thomas everything he needed to know. The time for questions about the future would have to wait. The baby was coming, and with it, all the choices that would define what kind of family they might become. The child came into the world fighting, as if she knew the struggle it would take to earn her place in it. Through the long hours of that October night, Thomas sat by the fire while Sarah labored, his hands useless and his heart hammering against his ribs like something trapped. He'd helped birth calves and foals, but this was different. This was James's child coming into a world James would never see, and Thomas felt the weight of that responsibility settling on him like snow. The cabin filled with sounds he'd never heard before, Sarah's breathing, deep and purposeful, the soft words of encouragement from Mrs. Henderson, the midwife he'd ridden hard to fetch from town. And then, just as the first pale light of dawn touched the windows, came a sound that changed everything. A thin, angry cry that seemed to shake the very walls. "It's a girl," Mrs. Henderson announced, her voice warm with satisfaction. Strong as a wildcat and twice as loud. Thomas stood up slowly, his legs stiff from hours of sitting, waiting, worrying. Through the gap in the blankets they'd hung for privacy, he could see Sarah holding the baby against her chest, tears streaming down her face. But they were good tears now, tears of relief and wonder and a fierce love that seemed to fill the entire room. "She's beautiful," Sarah whispered, and Thomas heard in her voice something he'd never heard before, pure, uncomplicated joy. Mrs. Henderson bustled around the cabin, cleaning up, making sure Sarah was comfortable, checking the baby with practiced hands. Thomas made coffee and tried to stay out of the way, but he found his eyes drawn again and again to the small bundle in Sarah's arms. "You can come closer," Sarah said softly. "She won't break." Thomas approached slowly, as if the baby were a wild animal that might spook if he moved too fast. When he was close enough to see her properly, his breath caught in his throat. She was tiny, perfect, with dark hair that stuck up in wild tufts and eyes that were already trying to focus on the world around her. "She looks like James," Sarah said, and Thomas heard the sadness mixed with the joy in her voice. Thomas studied the baby's face, looking for traces of his brother in the small features. Maybe there was something in the shape of her eyes, the stubborn set of her mouth. But mostly she just looked like herself, brand new and full of possibilities. "What will you name her?" Thomas asked. Sarah was quiet for a moment, her finger tracing the baby's cheek. "I was thinking Elizabeth. After my mother." "Elizabeth McCready," Thomas said, testing the sound of it. "That's a strong name." "Elizabeth Sarah McCready," Sarah corrected gently. "If that's all right with you." Thomas felt something shift inside his chest, something warm and unexpected. Sarah wasn't just giving the child his family name. She was making them all family together. Mrs. Henderson finished packing her things and accepted the money Thomas pressed into her hands. "I'll be back to check on them in a few days," she said. "But they both look strong." "You did good, getting her help when she needed it." After the midwife left, the cabin settled into a different kind of quiet. Not the careful silence of two strangers learning to live together, but the peaceful quiet of people who belonged in the same space. Sarah dozed with the baby against her shoulder, and Thomas found himself watching them both, memorizing the picture they made in the soft morning light. When Sarah woke, she found him sitting in the chair beside the bed, whittling a small piece of wood with his pocket knife. "What are you making?" she asked, her voice still heavy with sleep. "A rattle," Thomas said, holding up the partially carved piece. "Every baby needs a rattle." Sarah smiled, and Thomas realized it was the first completely happy smile he'd seen from her since that day on the courthouse steps. "Thomas," she said, shifting carefully so she could look at him properly, "I need to tell you something." He set down his whittling and gave her his full attention. "I know what you've done for us," she continued. "For me and for her. You didn't have to. James's mistakes weren't yours to fix." "Sarah, let me finish." Her voice was gentle but firm. "I know you married me out of duty, out of some idea that you owed something to James's memory. But this child, she's not James's debt to pay. She's her own person, and she deserves to be wanted for herself, not because of who her father was or wasn't. Thomas looked down at the tiny girl in Sarah's arms, sleeping peacefully despite the serious conversation happening around her. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that if you want us to stay, it can't be because you feel guilty about James. It has to be because you want us here. Because you want to be your father, not just James's replacement." The words hung in the air between them, and Thomas felt the weight of choice settling on his shoulders. He could say yes and spend his life trying to be the man James should have been. Or he could say no and let them go, knowing he'd done his duty, but nothing more. But as he looked at Sarah and the baby, he realized the choice had already been made somewhere deep inside him, made in all those quiet moments over the past months when caring for them had stopped feeling like an obligation and started feeling like coming home. "I want to be your father," he said, the words coming out rough but true. "Not because of James, but because of her. Because of you." Sarah's eyes filled with tears again, but these were the good kind, the kind that came when someone gave you exactly what you needed to hear. "And I want to be your wife," she said. "Really your wife, not just on paper. If you'll have me." Thomas reached out and touched the baby's tiny fist, marveling at how something so small could change everything so completely. "I'll have you both," he said, "for as long as you'll stay." The baby stirred in Sarah's arms, making small sounds that might have been protest or contentment. Thomas finished carving the rattle and handed it to Sarah, the wood smooth and warm from his hands. "Her first toy," he said. Sarah held the rattle up, and the baby's eyes tried to follow the movement, cross-eyed and serious. When Sarah shook it gently, it made a soft sound, and Elizabeth's mouth opened in what might have been surprise or delight. "She likes it," Sarah said, laughing. Thomas watched his wife and daughter, for that's what they were now, truly and completely, and felt something he hadn't experienced since before the war. The simple, profound satisfaction of being exactly where he belonged. Over the following weeks, as Sarah grew stronger and Elizabeth grew bigger, Thomas learned what it meant to be a father. He learned to change diapers and warm milk, to walk the floor at 2 in the morning when the baby couldn't sleep, to make faces that would coax a smile from the tiny girl who seemed to recognize his voice even when she was too young to understand his words. He learned that love didn't always come like lightning. Sometimes it came like sunrise, slow and steady and warming everything it touched. The wooden horse he'd given Sarah found a new home on the mantel, no longer a symbol of promises broken, but of promises kept. And sometimes, in the evenings when Elizabeth was sleeping and Sarah was mending clothes by the fire, Thomas would catch sight of it and think about James, not with anger or sadness, but with something approaching forgiveness. His brother had made mistakes, terrible ones that had cost him his life and nearly cost Sarah hers. But those mistakes had brought Thomas the family he'd never thought he'd have, the love he'd never thought he deserved. As winter settled over the cabin like a blanket, Thomas found himself planning for spring. He would expand the cabin, add another room for Elizabeth when she got bigger. Maybe plant some apple trees, start a real garden. Build something that would last, something that would grow instead of burning down. In the deep quiet of those winter nights, with Sarah sleeping beside him and Elizabeth in her cradle nearby, Thomas would listen to the wind outside and think about the strange paths that led people to where they needed to be. He'd started this journey trying to honor his brother's memory, but he'd ended up discovering something more valuable than duty or guilt. He discovered what it meant to choose love over blood, promise over debt, the future over the past. And in the morning, when Elizabeth woke them with her hungry cries and Sarah smiled at him over the baby's head, Thomas knew that some stories ended not with the words "the end," but with the words "and so it began."